It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. It's been almost a week since Venezuela's governing party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, won 18 out of the 23 governorships in regional elections. They were held last Sunday, October 15th. International corporate media coverage of the election results at large is still struggling to make sense of the unexpected results, since all of the polls prior to the election suggested a clear victory for the opposition-aligned governors. A common theme in the corporate media coverage of last Sunday's election seems to question the results, suggesting that President Maduro's party obtained the victories by way of election fraud. However, key opposition candidates in the governor's races in Venezuela are gradually accepting the results as legitimate, except for one controversial close race that is being challenged in the state of Bolivar, where opposition has some serious allegations due to the discrepancy in the results that the CNE announced, that's the Election Commission in Venezuela, the results that they announced, and the printout of the report that was given to each party by the voting machines. Joining me now to discuss the media coverage of Venezuela is Alex Main. He is a senior associate for international policy at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, where he focuses on foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Good to have you back, Alex.
Great to be on your show, Sharmini.
So, Alex, let's first, we will get to the controversial issue of what's happening in the state of Bolivar, but let's first take a look at the general thrust of the international media coverage of Venezuela and the way in which they keep repeating the fact that Venezuela is a dictatorship and Maduro is a rising dictator as far as the Venezuelan democracy is concerned. Let's have a look.
Venezuela's high court has dissolved the country's national assembly, effectively removing any government opposition. Critics are calling it a coup d'etat.
The opposition argues that this is just a power grab by Maduro to stay in power.
A disputed election could grant the ruling party almost unlimited power. Critics say the country appears headed for a dictatorship.
There are people who think this is a step towards dictatorship. What do you think?
No, not a step, said this man. We're in a dictatorship.
Protests turning deadly as the country reels from its controversial election, one being called by some a sham that gives the country's president sweeping powers. Critics say democracy is now eroding there, moving closer to a dictatorship there.
Maduro has consolidated his power, bringing the country closer to authoritarian rule.
Alex, now a lot of those clips were in relation to the Constituent Assembly that was elected, but this is generally the thrust when mainstream media, corporate media talks about Venezuela, and we want to tackle that head on. So as a longtime observer of Venezuela, I consider you are an expert who lived there for almost a decade. What is your evaluation of this type of claim by the corporate media?
Well, first of all, it's really nothing new. As you were mentioning, I was in Venezuela for quite a long time. I was there from 2002 until 2008. And, already in 2002, much of the corporate media internationally was suggesting that the presidency of Hugo Chavez had become something of a dictatorship. And completely ignoring some of the anti-democratic activities of the opposition parties in Venezuela, and namely a coup d'etat that was supported by most of Venezuela's opposition parties in April of 2002. This was initially represented as some sort of a popular uprising against the dictatorship. And it was really, I think, thanks to the reaction of other governments in the region that clearly saw that there was a coup d'etat, that the narrative began to change around that. But soon afterwards, we got back into this tradition of suggesting that there was creeping authoritarianism going on in Venezuela. And, very little was said about the fact that nearly every year, sometimes twice a year in Venezuela, you had elections being held at different institutional levels. And, these elections would typically have very big turnouts. They'd be very transparent, very free and fair. Really, no one had any legitimate complaints to make. And that's largely been true, for the last 15 years or so. In fact, it can be argued that the electoral system in Venezuela has gotten more and more refined in terms of the degree of transparency. And to the extent that, in fact, it's thanks in part to that transparency and the internal checks and balances that today you do have this controversy in the state of Bolivar, where the opposition is presenting some evidence that there's been a manipulation of results. They can do this, in fact, because they have records from electronic voting machines, which everyone, believes, and that they can present and show are not aligned with results that are appearing on sort of the official results that are appearing on the website of the CNE. Now, this is still a matter that's being resolved, still being settled. We don't actually know for certain whether the claims of the opposition are legitimate, but the fact is that you have a system that's in place that can very easily allow for verification, and where you can easily see whether there are discrepancies that have taken place. And as I said, this system has really been very effective. And you've had massive turnout, and it really is sort of a direct contradiction of this constant claim that the country is slipping into dictatorship. I mean, you don't have that when you have constant elections in which people, the majority of voters participate, and where you can have confidence in the results.
And this is this process that everyone keeps referring to. It's a pretty onerous process where even the Carter Election Observing Center has declared unusual in the world in terms of the way in which the people vote, and the way in which it is verified, and the way in which each individual voter actually gets their own results verified through a receipt, and so forth. So this perhaps cumbersome way to endorse the democratic process is legitimate. This is the very reason that the opposition is now able to challenge in the case of the state of Bolivar, which is a question that is still unresolved, that the CNE has not responded to.
No, that's right. And we'll have to see what happens in Bolivar. I think the opposition is filing an official complaint with what they believe is to be this evidence of manipulation of the numbers. And there's a process underway now, and we'll have to see the outcome of that process. It's, very, very important in terms of the integrity of this electoral system going forward, but we can't really draw any conclusions at this point. What we do see is that, the overall results of this election sort of run counter to this narrative that, the government of Venezuela and Chavismo as a movement, this sort of political movement created by Hugo Chavez, is on the verge of extinction. For in these elections where you had 61% participation, the PSUV won, fair and square. The results are not, being contested. There is no evidence of any kind of discrepancies between the official results and tally sheets in various voting centers. in the 22 other states of Venezuela. And we see that, the governing party has won in at least 17 of these 23 states. And overall, they have a margin of victory of, around 6 points nationally ahead of the opposition. So this suggests that there is a Chavista base that remains strong, even if the government, according to polls, is rather unpopular at the moment. They've had an increase in popularity recently, and we can discuss the reasons around that. But overall, it's not very popular. But I think one thing people need to keep in mind is that the government is one thing. Nicolas Maduro, the president, is one thing. Chavismo as a movement is another. It was interesting that I think back in June, a opposition-aligned surveyor, data analysis, said that they had results showing that over 50% of Venezuelans, basically still support Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez. They still, regard him positively. And this really suggests that there is a very strong movement that's still there, and that it needs to be kept in mind that these are not national elections; these are regional elections, and so local issues play an important part in voters' decisions. And in many cases, I think the governors who are running, the incumbents that were running, as well as new candidates running on the PSUV, the pro-government party ticket, were actually doing their best to sort of put some distance between themselves and the government of President Maduro, and really sort of running as their own candidates associated with Chavismo, but not so much with the government. And I think that is some of the explanation for these results, rather than some sort of massive fraud. Again, there isn't evidence of any massive fraud. There are problems in the state of Bolivar that need to be checked out. But overall, these elections went pretty smoothly, and the results are not really contested.
All right, Alex. Now, one thing we should note is following the end of the violent protests from last April to July, when you saw the international media zeroing in on these demonstrations that were very, very violent, and gas canisters being thrown, and creating a hype that Venezuela and its democracy was in serious trouble. But Venezuela seems to, since then, calm down, but the international media has also stopped covering the country and the legitimate elections that just took place. There's hardly any coverage of these processes that are going on and continuing to reinforce the democratic will of the people that is constantly and regularly underway, as you say. Why do you think these elections, these particular elections of the governorships, were not covered? Is it because they were regional elections, or the international media has no interest in covering the legitimate process, democratic processes of the Venezuelan people?
Well, of course, yeah, the stakes in these elections are not the same as in other elections, certainly not the same as presidential elections, and those are normally scheduled for the end of next year. I expect that we'll see a lot of media coverage around that time. But, these elections were quite important for the country, given that they were the first sort of broadly accepted elections take place. You've been mentioning earlier the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which was more controversial and which the opposition boycotted. These elections were sort of more normal elections, and the first kind of normal elections to take place, that is with the participation of the opposition and the pro-government party, PSUV, the first elections of this type to take place since the legislative elections of December 2015, where the pro-government party was absolutely trounced, where they lost by nearly 10 points, and where you had a vast majority of the newly elected members of Venezuela's National Assembly that belong to the opposition. And this created something of an institutional crisis for a variety of reasons. We don't need to go into all of them, but I think it's sufficient to say that you had a major problem of the National Assembly not recognizing the legitimacy of the elected president and his government, Nicolas Maduro, and vice versa. So non-recognition between two vital institutions for the country that really paralyzed things. So it was important in that context to see what would happen with these new elections, whether in fact Chavismo and the PSUV would be further undermined in the vote and show that it is heading for sort of an inevitable decline or not. And of course, kind of the dominant narrative in the media was that that's what should have happened. And again, for some of the reasons that I've already outlined, it's not what's happened. And in fact, it shows that Chavismo in Venezuela remains strong.
All right. Now, in spite of the controversies we've already talked about, there's been quite a few candidates that were running for governorship who lost, who has now come out and admitted that they have actually been defeated, and this adds to the credibility of the process. Give us some sense of how, for example, Henry Falcon of Lara State and Alejandro Fiola Cruz of Carabobo, and even other opposition leaders such as Henry Ramos Alap all came out and conceded, and what legitimacy this gives the process.
Well, yeah, I think it's very important. I think what you're seeing is that you have a sector of the opposition which believes that the only way to achieve power in the future, national power, is to abide by the Constitution and by the electoral game. Whereas you have other parts of the opposition, led by individuals like Maria Corina Machado, that are advocating essentially for a coup or for some sort of extra constitutional transition, that would, basically undermine the democratic institutions of Venezuela. But, this more hardline sector believes that everything is rigged and nothing can be accomplished, or whether they believe that or not is not clear. They certainly believe that in order to get to power, they need to sort of topple the government. And of course, have looked to the United States for support and have gotten support, I would say, from the Trump administration and from Marco Rubio, who's become sort of the main advisor on Latin America, certainly on Venezuela and Cuba, to President Trump.
All right. Now, Alex, I have a question for you about the OAS. I know we could do a whole segment on the OAS, but opposition leader Henry Ramos Alap took the OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro to task the other day by saying that Almagro should mind his own business when it comes to the elections in Venezuela. Here's a clip.
What Almagro says literally, any political force that participates in elections without guarantees transforms themselves into accomplices of fraud.
I think he's completely wrong. Don't give us so many lessons from outside, because we are the ones who are here. We are giving the fight, not from the OAS. We are liberating in situ, from the battlefield.
Alex, what is this with the OAS interfering in the election processes in Venezuela and feeling the liberty to comment on every development that takes place?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that this isn't the OAS. This is the Organization of American States Secretary General, Luis Almagro, who, without any sort of mandate from the member countries of the OAS, has sort of taken it on himself to be what he thinks is sort of the savior of Venezuela. And he's been very much aligned with the hardline opposition sectors in Venezuela that, refuse to play sort of by the institutional rule book in the country. And he has really, I think, sought to play into the efforts to destabilize Venezuela and to try to undermine, any legitimacy of the institutions, certainly the executive branch of the country, since late 2015. In late 2015, he insisted that OAS international observers needed to be present in the electoral process, which gave a huge victory to the opposition at the time in December of 2015, in order for that process to be legitimate. And without that, it couldn't be legitimate. And he literally got into a war of words with the head of the CNE, Tibisay Lucena, and with Venezuelan government officials, insisting. And, he's been on a sort of vicious campaign ever since. He really has it in for Nicolas Maduro's government, and it's become very, very personal for him. And he's been using the OAS as a sort of a platform to try to advance his efforts to get rid of the Venezuelan government. And in doing this, he's become, very much an ally of the hardline opposition sectors, along with hardline right-wing sectors in the U.S., such as, in the south of Florida, Marco Rubio and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and others, the sort of traditional actors that have, really been supportive of regime change in Cuba and Venezuela.
All right, Alex, I'll leave you with that, but we have a lot more to talk about in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sharmini.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.